Mr Speaker, I'm fair I'm going to disappoint an earlier speaker in his assumption that there would be no opposition to this bill spoken in the House. In the very short time since we've had access to this proposed bill, this piece of proposed legislation, we've been confronted with a difficulty that the Greens did in fact at the final reading support the legislation that this bill now seeks to extend for a further 2 years. On balance, however, we will oppose this bill as we think it's unfortunate that only a matter of a few months before the sunset clause in this 5-year-old piece of legislation takes effect, there is a somewhat belated attempt to leave in place what is an inadequate piece of legislation while work is done to develop a better alternative. It's been admitted by both sides who have spoken so far that this legislation has not been a success. It has not generated or presented the outcomes that were hoped for it. And we think time and energy would be better spent finding more positive and long-term solutions to the undoubtedly important task of securing just and fair outcomes for victims of crime, while also ensuring that the basic human rights of prisoners are also acknowledged and preserved, in line with both our domestic and indeed our international law and conventions. And we can safely predict that this position will once again make us vulnerable and stimulate certain parties to accuse us again of being soft on crime, of being out of step with public expectations and preferences. And in fact, we believe that the public mood is for outcomes that do genuinely work, rather than those that reflect the very narrow and very punitive approach of a few, and that's a point I'll refer to later. The 2005 Act restricts awards of compensation sought by specified human rights claims made by persons under the state's control or supervision, and provides for the making and determination of claims that the victim of a prisoner may make against compensation paid in respect of specified human rights claims made by a prisoner. It's a somewhat convoluted and complex solution to what was a very real problem, and it's worth recalling that at the time the legislation was triggered by findings that there has been systemic breaches of the Bill of Rights, particularly under the so-called Behaviour Management Program at Auckland Prison. These breaches included a failure to allow inmates on BMR adequate opportunities to exercise, failure to notify a medical officer when inmates were put under the program. There were issues around basic hygiene, around cell cleanliness, around access to clean clothing. Strip searches were routinely undertaken by officers with an adequate understanding of the grounds for conducting such searches. Many of these searches therefore did not comply with sections of the Penal Institutes Act. The court held that individually these unlawful acts would not have been sufficient to breach the Bill of Rights, but taken in combination they reveal treatment, and I quote, falling well below standards that befit a human being, including the treatment of a person behaving badly in prison, and therefore constituted breaches of the Bill of Rights. We originally opposed the 2005 Bill of Rights in its first reading. The bill that became the Act that the government is seeking to extend, due to concerns that it could be seen to violate prisoners' rights. It removed a mechanism for stopping abuse in prisons and went only a short way towards meeting the needs and legitimate expectations of victims of crime. We listened to the debate at the time, and we changed our position to support its third reading on a clear understanding there would be a comprehensive inquiry into prisoners' rights. And this inquiry was duly put in place and reported back to this House in December 2007. And it must be said that that report contained some very good recommendations, but there's too little evidence that those recommendations have been picked up by the former government or indeed the present one. The report, for example, at the time in 2007 proposed a one-stop shop for victim support, a properly resourced agency that could ensure victims and adequate access to adequate information, to services and to outcomes that were appropriate to their needs. An agency that did not rely solely on the goodwill of many hundreds of volunteers, and too much of the victim support work being done in the country now is left to NGOs, to poorly resourced voluntary and private organisations. The report in 2007 proposed the establishment of a compensation regime focused on recompensing victims for their loss, It recommended a gap analysis to identify where victim needs were not being met, and various other quite admirable proposals were made. There have been some good advances made since then. The Victims' Charter was mentioned earlier. That was a positive outcome. But it's difficult to support an argument that victims of crime are substantially better off now than they were 5 years ago. There is still a glaring need to establish an independent prison investigative authority, which the Greens have long advocated, and we could model such an agency on very good examples established in Britain or in Western Australia. So we will oppose this legislation, which in its present form has been more symbolic than real. Very few victims have benefited from it. Very few affected prisoners have taken advantage of the provisions within it. Arguably, very few of them know of it or indeed would choose to use it. The legislation overall, the continuance of this legislation, is symptomatic of the view that prisoners should lose any rights, which was specifically proposed by a speaker to a government speaker to debate this earlier in this session about prisoners' voting rights. Treating prisoners as non-citizens, as people not possessing rights or not deserving of rights, is entirely counterproductive and worsens post-release integration problems, and there is ample reason to adopt a more enlightened approach. Evidence from Scandinavia, and especially from Norway, shows that those systems which give most regard to human rights, that impose the fewest denials of human rights on convicted people, are those with the lowest levels of reconviction. Norway, for example, has a reconviction rate of 20%, where ours is effectively double that. Imagine the savings, both the financial savings, the benefits in terms of social and individual well-being we might see if we could emulate that here, if we could cut our reconviction rate in half. I mentioned that this legislation, that the provisions of the legislation are complex. In Finland, we know that the victims of crime are compensated by the state, who then enact appropriate measures against offenders to endeavour to recoup some of what has been paid to that offender. It's a much cleaner, more straightforward, much more appropriate mechanism than this rather convoluted legislation that we are confronted with. The concern that prisoners might somehow gain financial benefit that are denied to their victim is very easily resolved, and the point was made by the Minister presenting the bill. Put in place more and better mechanisms to protect the human rights of prisoners, ensure they are treated in accordance with national and international law and convention, and there will be no avenue for offenders to gain financial redress. There are solutions available to the admittedly very complex problem of needing to provide fair recompense to victims of crime without compromising our commitment to humane treatment and human rights for all citizens. But those will not be found in perpetuating an inadequate and badly dated piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.